When you are angry, you are never truly strong. You are simply losing control of your mind, your only true kingdom. Anger is a temporary madness, a fever that burns you before it ever reaches the person you are aimed at. Every minute spent in a rage is a minute of your life that you pay for with your own health and time you can never get back. Do you find yourself fuming over slow grocery clerks, barking dogs, or the mechanical voices on customer service lines? I have also let my temper cheat me out of peaceful afternoons. If we do not cool this fire, it is our own hearts that will suffer first. Today, we find the answers to cooling that flame in the wisdom of Marcus Aurelius. Stay with us to discover how to protect your peace, and if you find comfort here, please join our community by subscribing to this journey. Hello and welcome back to Lingering Light, your quiet retreat where the noise of the world softens into wisdom. I am truly grateful that you have chosen to spend a few moments of your evening with us. Tonight, we explore one of the most practical and life-saving chapters of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, the philosophy of the futility of anger. Marcus, who sat at the pinnacle of Roman power, knew that a single spark of rage could destroy an empire. To help us put out the fires of frustration, let us meet Rose the Dragon Rossi. Rose is 72 and the retired owner of a legendary Italian bistro in New Jersey. For 45 years, Rose ruled her kitchen with an iron whisk. But now that she is retired, the dragon finds herself picking fights with the world. Her doctor has given her an ultimatum to cool it before her heart quits the job. That is when she found a question in a small book that stopped her in her tracks. How much more damage is done by your anger than by the things that actually made you angry? Rose Rossi sat in her small, meticulously kept garden in the late afternoon sun, but she was not enjoying the fragrance of her roses or the gentle rustle of the New Jersey wind. Instead, her face was flushed a deep, alarming shade of crimson, a physical manifestation of the fire that had defined her for 72 years. In her hand, she gripped her favorite monthly cooking magazine as if it were a weapon of war. The crime was simple, yet to Rose, it was unforgivable. The new mailman, perhaps in a hurry or simply careless, had crimped the top right corner of the magazine while jamming it into her mail slot. To anyone else, this was a minor imperfection, a mere wrinkle in a piece of paper. But for a woman who had spent 45 years commanding a high-pressure Italian bistro with an iron whisk, this was a direct declaration of war against her sense of order. Rose sat there in the silence of her garden, but her mind was a roar of noise. She was busy rehearsing a scorched earth monologue, a verbal takedown so sharp it would make the poor mailman reconsider his entire career path. She could feel her pulse thumping in her neck, a rolling boil of indignation. It was in this moment of peak frustration that she remembered the small, leather-bound book she had picked up at a garage sale. She reached for Marcus Aurelius's Meditations and flipped to a page she had bookmarked. She read the words of the emperor: "When you wake up, say to yourself that the people you deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, and surly, but none of them can hurt you, for you have seen the beauty of good." Rose let out a sharp, cynical grunt. "Easy for you to say, Marcus," she grumbled to the empty air. "You were an emperor, you didn't have a mailman who treats a delicate recipe for osso buco like a piece of grocery store junk mail. It's the principle of the thing, he needs to learn respect." She felt justified in her rage, believing that her anger was a shield protecting her dignity. But then, her eyes drifted to a line further down the page that felt like a bucket of ice water poured over her head. Marcus wrote, "Anger is never without a cost. To be angry is to rebel against the natural order. Every minute you spend in a rage is a minute of your life you will never get back, and you are paying for it with your own health." Rose stopped. The silence of the garden finally began to seep in. She looked down at her own hands and noticed they were trembling. She did a quick mental calculation. She had spent over 2 hours sitting here, fuming, letting her blood pressure skyrocket, her chest feeling tight, and a dull, familiar throb starting behind her eyes. And for what? She looked at the magazine again. It was a slightly wrinkled piece of paper. She could still read every single word of the recipes. She could still see every vibrant photo of the food. The damage to the magazine was almost invisible, but the damage to her own body was real and measurable. Rose realized with a jolt of dry laughter that she was paying a luxury tax on a very cheap emotion. She had always thought her anger meant she was being respected, but the truth was she was being cheated by her own temper. She had charged herself $50 worth of stress and physical exhaustion for a 10-cent wrinkle. She had allowed a careless stranger to reach into her chest and twist her heart, all over a magazine corner. It was in that moment of quiet clarity that the dragon began to stir in a different way. She realized that the mailman had not stolen her peace, she had handed it to him on a silver platter. She looked at her reflection in the glass of the patio door and saw not the wrinkled magazine, but her own wrinkled, weary spirit. She had spent 72 years fighting these tiny battles, never realizing that she was losing the war for her own happiness. The price of that crimped corner was far too high, and for the first time in her life, Rose decided she was no longer willing to pay it. Rose Rossi had always prided herself on her New Jersey strength. In the high-stakes and frantic world of her legendary Italian bistro, she was the undisputed boss. For 45 years, she lived by a simple code: if you do not bark, nobody listens. She believed that if she did not throw a sauté pan once in a while or make the very walls shake with her voice, she would lose her authority and the risotto would end up mushy. To Rose, her volume was her crown and her temper was her scepter. She equated her ability to instill fear with her ability to lead. But as she sat in her quiet garden at 72 years old, Marcus Aurelius offered her a different and much more stinging definition of power. He wrote in his Meditations that to be moved by passion is not manly or strong, but that mildness and gentleness are more human and therefore more powerful. He taught that it is the person who has no anger who has the most true power in this world. Marcus believed that a man who is steady and calm is like a marble statue that remains unshaken while the wind howls around it. Rose closed her eyes and allowed her mind to drift back to a busy Saturday night at the bistro 10 years ago. The dining room was packed, the air was thick with the smell of garlic and wine, and the stress was palpable. A young waiter, only 19 years old and visibly trembling from the pressure, had been carrying a tray of her most expensive crystal glasses. In a sudden moment of clumsiness, his foot slipped, and the tray went down. The sound was like a car crash, a series of sharp, final explosions that brought the entire restaurant to a haunting silence. Rose had erupted instantly. She screamed so loud that every guest stopped eating and every fork stayed suspended in midair. She called the boy every name in the book, her face turning that familiar shade of deep crimson. In that moment, she thought she was being powerful, a fierce queen defending her treasure and her standards. She felt justified in her rage, believing she was teaching a lesson in excellence. But now, looking through the wise eyes of Emperor Marcus, she saw the pathetic truth of that night. She was not strong, she was a victim of a broken glass. The glass shattered, and then her dignity shattered right along with it. Her peace was so fragile and so cheap that a clumsy 19-year-old could destroy it in a single second. She realized she was not the boss that night, the broken glass was the boss. It pulled her strings, and she danced exactly how it wanted her to dance, a puppet of a $20 object. Real strength, she now understood, would have been standing there, calm and unshaken, and simply saying it is just glass. It would have been the ability to look at the mess and prioritize the human being over the broken crystal. She had been the weakest person in the room that night because she was the one who had completely lost herself. True authority comes not from the loudness of a shout, but from the depth of a silence that cannot be swayed by the chaos of the world. Marcus Aurelius often advised his readers to perform a simple yet profound physical experiment whenever they felt the fires of rage beginning to consume them. He suggested that we should immediately seek out a mirror and observe our own reflection in the middle of a fit of temper. The emperor believed that if we could truly see the distorted, frantic, and even ugly version of ourselves during a tantrum, we would be so deeply repulsed that we would never want to inhabit that version of a human being ever again. He famously wrote that anger makes the face unrecognizable to the soul. It is a moment where our reason is eclipsed by a temporary insanity, and our physical appearance becomes a witness to that internal collapse. Consider how much more often you suffer from your anger and grief than from those very things for which you are angry, he taught. The pain caused by the reaction is always greater than the pain of the event itself. Rose Rossi decided to put this stoic experiment to the test. A few days after her garden realization, the perfect opportunity presented itself. She was sitting on her sofa, ready to watch the season finale of her favorite cooking competition. Just as the judges were about to announce the winner, the screen flickered and then went black. A message appeared stating that the cable internet connection had been lost. Instantly, Rose felt that familiar, scorching heat of the dragon rising from her stomach to her throat. Her first instinct was to grab the phone and unleash a verbal hurricane on the first customer service agent unlucky enough to answer her call. She wanted to demand why she was paying such high monthly fees for a service that failed her at the most critical moment. But instead of reaching for the phone, she remembered the emperor. She forced herself to stand up and walk into the hallway, where a large, gold-framed mirror hung on the wall. She stood under the bright hallway light and stared at the woman looking back at her. What she saw was a revelation of the most uncomfortable kind. There stood a woman with a clenched jaw so tight it looked painful. Her eyes were bulging and bloodshot, filled with a frantic and pointless energy. Her skin was a splotchy, angry shade of red, a color she jokingly thought of as overcooked marinara sauce. But beyond the colors and the lines, she saw the expression. It was a face that looked exhausted, old, and utterly devoid of happiness. There was no dignity in that reflection. There was no power or authority. There was only a tired, angry woman who had allowed a piece of plastic and a digital signal to rob her of her grace. "Good grief, Rose," she whispered to the woman in the glass. "Look at you. You look like you are about to go to war in a gladiator arena, and all that happened was the Wi-Fi blinked. Is this the face you want your grandchildren to remember? Is this the legacy of the dragon you want to leave behind? A woman who turns into a monster because of a television show?" She stood there for several minutes, consciously taking deep breaths as Marcus had instructed. She focused on relaxing her shoulders, which had been hiked up to her ears. She watched as the tension began to drain away. Slowly, the fierce crimson of her cheeks began to fade into a soft pink. The hard, jagged lines around her mouth began to smooth out into the lines of character and experience she had earned over 72 years. Her eyes lost their frantic glint and returned to the warm, intelligent brown she recognized as her true self. "Keep this thought handy when you feel a fit of temper coming on," Marcus seemed to whisper from the hallway shadows. "It is not strength to be consumed by anger. It is a loss of self. You are handing over your identity to a machine." The Wi-Fi did not take my peace, Rose realized, her voice now a gentle, steady hum. "I was handing it over like a free sample at a bakery to anyone who walked by. No more. My peace is not for sale, and it certainly is not for free." She walked back to the living room, and even though the screen was still black, she felt a profound sense of victory. She had seen the madness in the mirror, and for the first time in her life, she had chosen to walk away from it. For Rose Rossi, the most frequent and exhausting source of anger was always a perceived sense of disrespect. After 45 years of running a successful business and raising a family, she felt she had earned a certain level of deference from the world. If a driver cut her off in traffic without using a blinker, she did not just see a bad driver, she perceived it as a personal attack on her 45 years of hard work. If a teenager in line did not hold the door open, she felt her entire dignity was being trampled upon by a generation that did not care. She walked through the world with a hair trigger, her ego acting like a sensitive radar looking for the slightest hint of an insult. But the Emperor Marcus Aurelius had a very specific and quite humbling remedy for this kind of inflated dignity. He called it the view from above. He taught his readers to practice a mental exercise where they would rise in their imagination, higher and higher, until they were looking down at the earth from the very highest star in the heavens. Marcus wrote that Asia and Europe are merely tiny corners of the universe, and the entire ocean is just a single drop in the vastness of space. He reminded himself that the present moment, with all our little dramas and insults, is just a tiny point in infinite time. Why worry about a single point in an ocean of eternity? He encouraged us to understand that in 100 years, the rude driver will be gone, the disrespectful teenager will be gone, and even Rose herself will be gone. The cars they drive will be heaps of rusted dust in a junkyard, and the roads they fought over will likely be covered by the earth once again. In the grand scheme of the cosmos, nothing of these tiny frictions will remain. Rose decided to practice this cosmic perspective while sitting in her local pharmacy. She was standing in line behind an elderly man who had been arguing with a young pharmacist for 15 minutes over a $2 coupon for toothpaste. The man was red in the face, and the pharmacist was visibly losing his patience. Instead, Rose closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She practiced the view from above. She imagined herself rising up through the ceiling of the pharmacy, past the birds and the clouds, until the entire town looked like a miniature toy set. She kept going until she was looking down from the moon. From that immense height, the pharmacy was invisible. The argument over the $2 coupon was less than a whisper. The man, the pharmacist, and Rose herself were nothing more than three tiny, flickering sparks in a vast and silent dark universe. From that height, the argument did not look like an insult or a tragedy. It looked like a silent, funny movie. It looked like two little ants bumping into each other over a crumb of sugar. Rose found herself beginning to smile. She realized that her right-of-way and her busy schedule were about as important as a single grain of salt in a 5-gallon pot of boiling pasta water. It was not an insult, it was just a tiny, insignificant anthill in the middle of a majestic mountain range. "We are just tiny sparks in a dark universe," Rose chuckled quietly to herself. "Marcus, you are right. It is actually kind of beautiful and a little bit silly how much we care about dollars or a few minutes of time when we have the whole infinite sky to look at." She spent the rest of the wait simply enjoying the feeling of the cool air conditioning on her skin and the quiet rhythm of her own breathing. When it was finally her turn at the counter, she did not snap at the pharmacist. She gave him a kind, patient smile, recognizing that his stress was just another tiny point in time that would soon pass. She walked out into the sunlight feeling lighter than she had in decades, realizing that when you stop carrying the weight of the whole world's respect on your shoulders, you finally have the energy to simply enjoy the walk. The most challenging aspect of Marcus Aurelius's philosophy that Rose Rossi found truly difficult to accept was his radical assertion that we should be kind to those who anger us. Marcus taught that we should view those who offend us not as enemies, but as confused souls who simply do not know what is genuinely good. He believed that no human intentionally chooses to do wrong, rather, they lack the inner vision to distinguish between what is helpful and what is harmful. He famously wrote that even those who err are our relatives, possessing the same divine spirit as we do. However, Rose decided to apply this difficult teaching to her relationship with her son-in-law, Kevin. Kevin was a decent man and a diligent worker, but he had one repetitive habit that drove Rose crazy: he often forgot to call her on Sunday afternoons. For Rose, this Sunday call was her emotional anchor for the week. When the phone remained silent, she not only felt lonely but also felt ignored and worthless. She spent the entire Monday morning sharply honing her words, rehearsing a journey of guilt that was professional and sharp enough to cut through a thick steak. She would dwell on every sacrifice she had ever made for her daughter and how Kevin's forgetfulness was a sign of his deep ingratitude. She would build a monument of resentment, block by block, until she was ready to unleash the dragon the next time they spoke. But this time, leaning back in her favorite armchair with the meditations in her lap, Rose tried on her new stoic glasses. She thought about Marcus's words: "The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury." She stopped herself from building the monologue of anger. Instead, she asked herself a series of questions she had never considered before. Maybe Kevin is not trying to hurt me on purpose? Maybe he spent the entire weekend trying to keep two toddlers from tearing the house apart while also catching up on work emails? Maybe he is fighting a silent battle at his office that I know nothing about? Rose realized that Kevin was not evil Kevin trying to disrespect his mother-in-law. He was simply tired Kevin, a man losing his way under the heavy weight of modern life. So, when Monday afternoon came and Kevin still hadn't called to apologize, Rose didn't wait for his sheepish excuse. She picked up the phone herself and dialed his number. When he answered, sounding frantic and stressed, Rose didn't use her sharp dragon voice. Instead, she let her words be a gentle hum. She said, "Hey honey, I was just thinking about you. I figured your weekend was absolutely crazy with the kids and work, and I just wanted to call and say I understand. I love you, and I am so proud of the father and husband you are. I am lucky to have you as my son-in-law." The silence on the other end of the line lasted for a long time. It was a silence so heavy and profound that Rose could almost hear Kevin's heart beginning to soften. When he finally spoke, his voice was trembling. He told her how much that meant to him and how he had been feeling like he was failing at everything lately. The kindness Rose offered acted like a bridge over a chasm of resentment she had been digging for years. She realized that by choosing empathy over anger, she had not lost a battle, she had won a family. The dragon's fire had been replaced by a grandmother's warmth, and for the first time in her life, Rose Rossi felt like a true emperor of her own heart. She had learned that empathy is not a weakness, it is the ultimate strength of a soul that refuses to be dragged down into the mud of bitterness. My dear friends at Lingering Light, Rose Rossi spent 72 years believing that the fire of her anger was the only thing protecting her fortress. She thought that if she stopped roaring, the world would forget she existed. But through the timeless wisdom of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, she discovered a truth that changed the very rhythm of her life. Her anger was not protecting her home, it was burning it down from the inside out. Every burst of rage was a crack in her own foundation, a tax on her health, and a shadow over her relationships. She finally saw that the dragon was her own worst enemy, stealing the peace she had worked so hard to earn. She learned that the greatest luxury of our senior years is not having everyone agree with us, or being the boss of every situation, or even being respected by every stranger we meet. The greatest luxury in this life is a cool heart. It is the ability to walk through a storm of chaos, disrespect, and inconvenience and remain completely dry. It is the power to observe the world's madness without letting it enter your own spirit. This is the true meaning of Stoic peace. It is not about being a robot without feelings, it is about being a king or queen who chooses which feelings are allowed to sit on the throne of their mind. Marcus Aurelius leaves us with one of his most beautiful metaphors: be like the cliff against which the waves continually break, standing firm and taming the fury of the water around it. Think about that for a moment. You do not have to fight the waves. You do not have to scream back at the ocean. You simply have to be the steady, unmoving cliff. The waves will crash, they will foam, and they will eventually retreat, but the cliff remains exactly as it was, dignified and unshaken. You can be that steady, cool stone in the lives of your children, your neighbors, and even for yourself. You can be the one who tames the fury of the world just by being a calm presence within it. Tonight, I want to ask you to look closely at your own life. What is the one boiling pot that keeps threatening to overflow? Is there a person who knows exactly how to push your buttons, or a situation that makes your inner dragon want to roar in frustration? How will you use the view from above to shrink that problem down to the size of a grain of sand? How will you use Marcus's mirror to check your reflection before you let a single harsh word escape your lips? I invite you to share your stories of cooling the kitchen in the comments below. Let us build a community of cliffs, standing firm together against the noise of the world. As we conclude our time together, I want you to remember that your peace is your most precious possession. Do not give it away like a free sample to anyone who happens to be rude or careless. Protect your calm heart with everything you have. Observe your reflection in the mirror of your soul and ensure it is a face you can be proud of. Stay in the steady, cool light of a quiet soul, and let that light guide you through whatever storms may come tomorrow. Thank you for being part of our Lingering Light family. I truly look forward to our next gathering where we will continue to find wisdom in the quiet places. Good night, dear friends. Please show your support by hitting the like button and subscribing if you haven't already. Your presence here makes all the difference. Thank you.